Okay, hi everybody. Okay, so today Imogen I are here to talk about something in particular that our clients tend to ask us a fair amount about, which is the kind of snapping, clicking, popping of joints that they can hear sometimes. For some clients, it's something that's always happened throughout their lives, their knees or their shoulders. Something has always kind of made that noise. And for some people, it's kind of a new event or something that's happened over time or increased as they have got older. Um, and then the majority of the time, what we tend to find is that obviously, particularly if it has been something that has been happening regularly throughout their life, it is just a relatively normal thing for that person for it to happen. It tends to be, related to air bubbles, which are in our synovial fluid, which is the fluid that kind of surrounds the liquid that surrounds our joints. And it can be in things like knees, ankles, shoulders, for example, or in the hip area even. And the majority of cases, it is just that snapping and clicking sound can just be stretched ligaments, as they slide onto kind of more bony structures around in that area. For some people, if it's something that's come on over time, it tends to be kind of sometimes cartilage that's been wearing down. And, it's not a major problem for most people. But obviously, there can be incidents where it can be quite painful. If it is accompanied by pain or swelling, then that is something that we then, either can perhaps give a bit of advice of, but if it is particularly bad, then we tend to say, it's also something you need to perhaps go and see a doctor about or a consultant about. What kind of do you have a kind of similar experience in terms of your clients and what they are coming with? Are there particular areas on the body where you find that is most common, or is it a little bit kind of you get it with all kind of different areas of the body with yourself, Imogen?
Yeah, it's similar to you. Knees are quite common. Shoulders are another common area that people often talk about. And sometimes people talk about it in the back or the neck.
Mm.
And it can sound quite loud in the neck, and people get quite worried about that one, but it's purely just based on location to the ear usually. I find as if you can hear it quite a loud popping, because most of the time they're like, can you hear this? And I'm like, not really. So usually in areas like that where it's closer to ear and things as well, it will sometimes sound louder, but just because the sound of it's making doesn't really indicate any issue. And like you say, it's the same. It's either the sort of, I tend to find if you can only do it one time, then that's when I tend to sort of explain that it's more of that like popping. Whereas if it's a bit more repetitive, then it tends to suggest it's, like you say, the tendons, ligaments, maybe a bit more cartilage, just because it's that type of like strumming on a guitar type sensation instead. And then again, like you say, the only time I tend to really be a problem is that actually it's usually if it is causing pain, if it's feeling like things are grinding where they shouldn't, or if things are feeling a bit unstable. Sometimes they're the times that, like you say, you'd want to kind of be like, okay, let's go get this checked out. And like you said, with the swelling and stuff. And I was saying to you about this, didn't I? So, because it is like, especially for those that where it hasn't always done it, and then they start to feel it,
Yeah.
it can be quite common for that, especially if you are starting working on like strength and mobility, because it just generally gives you a sign that something's tight and you're doing something about it, so things are moving again. So sometimes I'm like, actually, it's not a bad thing if you're hearing that. Like, it's sometimes a suggesting that change is happening, or just telling you something you already know. But I was saying to you about it with particularly the more like the joint popping, so that
Yeah.
with the fluid in the joint. I was at, oh God, I can't even remember how many years ago it was now. It was a conference I did for therapists a few years ago, and we were talking on one of the sessions about with a Pilates instructor, and she gave me my favorite anecdote of explaining this sort of thing ever, because the way she explained it is, like you said, because of in the joint you've got that fluid and it creates the air bubbles. When it's popping, she refers to it, and to kind of put her clients at ease, as a joint fart, because it's essentially all it is. It's that release of air.
Yeah. And it
So
absolutely makes sense. And
when
it's
people ask,
Yeah, I mean that is a. I mean, you're not going to forget that phrase, are you? You know, when we had this conversation last week, I thought it was the best way to describe it, and also to kind of remember later down the line what that is, because sometimes we kind of find out information about these things, and then we kind of forget, you know, why it is that those are happening, and then whether that is a common occurrence or not. But that is a great way to describe it, and certainly to remember it. I do find, I mean, there's two kind of areas in particular that I find my clients tend to have the most issues. The first one is shoulders. Now, obviously, shoulders are super complex anyway. And I do have a lot of clients with shoulder injuries, and they often kind of think that that kind of cracking or popping sound can be, you know, as a result of an injury, which of course it can. But as I said before, you know, if it's not necessarily accompanied by pain or swelling, or pain and swelling together, it's not necessarily a bad thing. On the occasions where they do have that pain, when you have that kind of clicking sound, and often it is when you're doing a kind of external rotation type movement within the shoulder using rotator cuff muscles. Sometimes obviously it's an issue with those actual muscles rather than actually the joint. But that kind of sound, like you said, that kind of grinding sound in particular that you might experience, often with shoulders tends to be, and it's not always, you know, this is not always necessarily the answer, but it can be that the labrum, which is like the rubbery cartilage which kind of lines your shoulder joint, okay, the socket called the glenoid, this is something that kind of helps obviously to keep the ball and socket kind of together, to keep the joint in place and nice and stable. But sometimes if someone's had particularly sporting injuries, or you know, they've maybe sometimes even been in an accident, like a car accident, fallen off their bike, is quite common as well, then it might be that that has kind of been pulled out of place. And they have kind of got some micro tears around the labrum, which is then, whilst that is then moving, so it might be kind of, you know, pulled out of place. It might have kind of caused a bit of you know, it makes it quite rough, if you like, in terms of like the little micro tears. So that kind of grinding that you can hear is, if it's not quite fully in the right place, it might be kind of making that kind of grinding sound as it's kind of going into place properly and kind of slightly coming out, because that labrum acts as a bit like a vacuum, you know, that vacuum kind of keeps it sucked in, that labrum. But if obviously it's got damage, it's not quite got the suction that it would normally have. So therefore that's kind of one of the biggest issues which I find with some of my clients, when particularly, as I say, when they've got some sort of often shoulder injury, could be rotator cuff, etc. But obviously, in general, the majority of cases, it's not always that, but sometimes it is just a case of actually what you can do to reduce that kind of clicking and popping sound is to strengthen, obviously, just the muscles all around around the joint, to reduce that sound. So obviously with shoulders, it will be kind of strengthening kind of deltoids, but again, not just those big prime mover muscles of the shoulder, for example, but things on the back of the shoulder, like your rotator cuff muscles. So you've got your infraspinatus on the back of your shoulder blade, and then your subscapularis on the other side, and then you've got your things like your teres minor, which is just on that smaller muscle connecting to the humerus, onto just below your shoulder blade there. All of those muscles kind of can be a bit left behind, or if they're a little bit weaker than they should be, then again, improving the strength of those can really help as well. And that's similar to when we've got knee issues as well. So again, improving not just kind of your big, you know, your big prime mover muscles like your quads and your hamstrings, but actually all of those kind of stabilizer muscles around your knee as well, kind of equally important to kind of make sure that you strengthen those, and that can kind of reduce the sound. Again, a lot of people have issues kind of cracking through knees, but again, if it's not kind of surrounded by kind of swelling, or if you've not got pain through it, it's not necessarily a big issue, but you can actually reduce that kind of cracking and popping that goes on just by kind of strengthening in general. I don't know if there's anything else you recommend to your clients that you know that they might do to kind of reduce any issues around that as well.
A little bit on that, actually. I was just thinking what you were saying and stuff. depending on which joint it clicks, one of the ones I often end up talking about is it can also sort of help highlight what you do, because like obviously some of the accessory muscles and stuff like you've mentioned for the different joints is really helpful, but you know how, so between the different joints in the body, some of them are more mobile and produce more movement at a joint, whereas some are a bit more sort of stable and have more limited movement. So I quite often will recommend for the joints that are clicking that are more mobile or supposed to be more mobile. So that would be things like ankle, shoulder, hip, for a sort of example. Those three, I quite often end up sort of suggesting that sometimes that sort of gentle mobility type movement, and sometimes particularly shoulder when you're not actually sort of putting any too much load on it. So simply like, you know, like your pendulum swing.
Yes.
Those types of ones quite good, because sometimes, like you say, you've got if muscles that are supposed to be supporting aren't doing their job, you're then relying on the bigger muscles, which are likely to be the ones that are tight and causing some of that pulling across the joint. That if you can then take it out of gravity and create a little bit of stretch, and you kind of get almost like oiling the joint, you're getting it fluidity back into the by warming up sort of through that soft tissue. That can be quite a really quite a good way, especially when that sort of clicking sort of sound is sometimes feels like it's sort of that stiff, and it's like, oh, I really need to click that in order for it to feel free. Sometimes that sort of gentle mobilization type movement can be really useful. And again, I mean, it is useful for knees and stuff as well, where knees don't, they only really bend and straighten. There is a tiny bit of rotation, but not much. Its main movement is bend and straight. So with that one, because it's weight bearing, again, that sort of just sitting and swinging your legs off again can be quite a nice way. And you might find that you'll get a bit of cracking and stuff and popping and clicking to begin with, but as long as you're gentle and kind of you're not forcing it to its end ranges and stuff, and you're just gently sort of taking those I can't say those reps.
Yeah, just shorten it to just reps.
Whole word. You'll eventually find it does ease up, and it will sort of start to feel free, and you might find that it stops clicking like that. So that can be quite a nice quick way. And then the strengthening stuff support for the long term.
100%. Yeah, totally agree. You know, that's why, you know, I do a lot of mobility work with people as well, like the journey, you know, whether it's kind of through injury or, like you say, just kind of, you know, trying to, you know, improve things in terms of loosening things up, making sure you're not too tight all the time. You know, that is the beginning part, isn't it? It's the kind of the mobilizing and the flexibility first, and then, you know, thinking about the strengthening as you go along, and all of those things, that nice combination is going to kind of help, along with obviously things like, you know, your soft tissue massage and all those little
one of my
kind of add
that
in.
sort of thing. Your techniques that would be good is the stuff you can do with like at home with like the balls and rollers as well, is that soft tissue release, because you get that gentle sort of stretching type movement, but with you can pinpoint it a little bit more. That's when I will often reach for that sort of stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, it always is a great kind of combination, isn't it, for all of those things. Kind of, you know, we are just, like you say, sometimes it can just be just a bit too kind of stiff. We just need to kind of do a bit more of a release. We need to keep things nice and mobile. And, you know, sad to say it, I say it all the time to my clients, but as we get older, you know, things aren't as elastic as they once were, and we do need to work a little bit harder, particularly on the mobility side of things, just to kind of, you know, stretch things out. That's where you kind of warm ups, you know, it doesn't have to be super long warm ups before you're going to do strength training or going out for a run or going for a cycle, but just some short little kind of really key kind of warm ups to kind of stretch out those tendons, ligaments, prepare kind of muscles, get things a bit looser, will just kind of, it's just a preventative measure, isn't it, for later down the line where things will just be a bit tighter otherwise, and just kind of will reduce that, you know, that idea of it being, yes, popping and clicking, but also just feeling tight as well, and feeling like you have to have some sort of release until it does click to get back into place. You know, you can reduce the need to have to do that, really. Okay, so
it's the same of like we're touching on.
No, go on.
I will chat about this all day. No, I was just going to say that with the warm-up stuff, it will also help about with like not just like your tendons and ligaments, muscles, you'll get the connective tissue as well, because that and that can get stiffer, not just with age, but even like if you're cold, if you're like dehydrated and things, because it's like that corn flour and water type
Yes.
substance. So with warm-ups and the mobility stuff, like sometimes that in itself can help kind of get it moving and sliding, because if that tissue is sort of tighter, I always explain it is a bit like, you know, when you put your tights on, or leggings for those that don't wear tights, and you, or tight jeans, anything that's tight, and you don't quite get the in the right place, it's a bit awkward to move. So sometimes that when you're doing that sort of mobility work, all the warm-ups and stuff like this, it helps kind of, it's almost similar sort of principle as if you wear, when you're wearing those tight clothing, that you can't just move it in one go, you have to kind of do those little bits of movement to get it back to where it needs to be, so you can move more freely. The warm-ups and stretching type stuff, it's similar sort of a principle, where it will kind of help you kind of gradually build that movement back so you can move freely, and then that sort of freedom in the range of movement over the joints and stuff comes back, so it doesn't feel so restricted. And like it's gonna
and that's it, you know, it is, you know, it is, that's a good way to describe it. It's that feeling of restriction sometimes, isn't it, that can kind of increase, you know, the popping and clicking, so the more you can kind of release that, the better, really. So yeah, no, that's great. Okay, right. It was going to be a short and sweet one today, but we like to talk about these topics as much as we can. But thanks for joining me again, and we'll head on to our next topic very soon. See you soon.